New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Today we are going to examine and question some of our basic assumptions, and it would probably take me the entire half hour of our program to introduce my guest, Donald Michael. He is a former policy advisor and analyst for numerous organizations, the Brookings Institution, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Peace Research Institute. He has written numerous books, including Cyber Nation, The Next Generation, Planning to Learn and Learning to Plan. He is currently an emeritus professor at the University of Michigan in both psychology and also planning and public policy. Welcome, Don.
Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Delighted to be with you.
You know, one of the areas in which you've written is the whole issue of information explosion. Many people would seem to feel that we now have so much information and knowledge is power, we can really control things. We are at a point in history where we can command the world about us because of our science and our vast amount of knowledge. And you point out something quite extraordinary, and that is that the more information that we have, the less we really know.
It isn't so much the less we really know as the more uncertain we are about what we know. It seems to me is the case, and there are several reasons for that. One, in many areas, the more information we get, the more we realize how much more we need. For example, with toxic substances, we know that they're in our bodies, but we don't know how they affect us, for example. Or economics is a perfect example. The more information we get, the more we know economic theories are inadequate for explaining the economic information. Another way that information increases uncertainty is it raises doubts about the sources of the information itself. Because a lot of our information is about the questionableness of those sources.
In other words, the more the press scrutinizes the government, the less people trust the government.
Or the press, or whatever, big business or the like. So we've got a society in which a substantial bit of information is to doubt the information. And then I think there's another aspect to this that's very important that increases the uncertainty, and that is the pool of information gets larger and larger, and then depending on what you already believe or the group you're involved with believes, you can dip into that pool and make a case for your beliefs. But that means many beliefs can do that around any particular issue.
I suppose it's analogous to people who can justify anything they want to justify by quoting some portion of the Bible.
Exactly.
Only the Bible is now much larger.
The Bible is infinitely large. That's a very good example. So there's not only two sides to every issue, there are 10 sides to every issue. And then people begin to doubt, the ones listening to the discussion, if they're not already totally committed to whatever position they've taken, they begin to doubt anybody really knows.
How do we know who to trust at this point?
That's right.
I recall a recent book that came out called The Experts Speak, and it quoted hundreds and hundreds of experts who all made mispronouncements about things.
It's a very serious matter for all kinds of activities, ranging all the way from who am I, where am I in this world, what's meaningful, what can I count on, what can I trust, to how do you conduct organizations or governments or the like. Because on the one hand, that information is valuable. It does allow action, but you can't be sure of the consequences of it because it's never complete.
Yeah.
So we live in a more and more problematic world.
An age of uncertainty.
An age of uncertainty.
It would seem, well, I've been strongly influenced by a man I know you've studied with, Sorokin at Harvard, who pointed out that unless there is some kind of underlying metaphysical ideal which coheres a society together, then things do tend to fall apart. And he described our present age as one in which things are falling apart. It's a period of transition, perhaps, between an old way of looking at things, which is broken down, and a new way of looking at things at which we have not yet evolved.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Sorokin was one of the first to, one of the many to point that out. Nietzsche pointed it out before him, of course, and Kierkegaard. So it wasn't a new idea that the mythology that holds a culture together, and I mean myth in the positive sense, it gives meaning and coherence, and it tells you what to pay attention to and what you can ignore, that mythology has come apart, and there have been many writers since then. Now, whether it's a transition to something else is an open question, because we'd like to believe that it goes somewhere, and I suppose in some sense human beings can only tolerate a certain level of uncertainty and ambiguity, and then they seek out and cling to something that will give them assurance and meaning.
Well, there's a lot of psychological research indicating that many people have a very low toleration for ambiguity, that they'd rather see a perfect square or a perfect cube than some kind of fuzzy, vague, amorphous diagram, for example.
Well, agree, and I think that works on several levels. First off, at the sheer biological level, uncertainty means you don't know where your enemies are. I mean, as creatures on the pampas,
or your next meal,
or your next meal, exactly. And so there's a biological level of uncertainty that is just intolerable. But then, if you're living in a world where the mythology has come apart, and where the events are increasingly turbulent and unpredictable, as is the case in our world, that uncertainty, there's probably a limit for many people on how much they can tolerate under those turbulent circumstances, some more than others, but I think we see evidences all through this society and around the world that there are an awful lot of people, the majority probably, who want a place to stand and a meaning, and they do not want to cope with the excitement that goes with that uncertainty as well, the possibilities that go with it.
So many people postulate that they have the answer. It could be a spiritual answer, or a new science will be the answer, or a new technology, or a new political viewpoint, but they feel convinced that some philosophy, some dogma is the way.
The truth, this is the way it really is, definitely.
And you are just the type of curmudgeon who goes around suggesting to people that while the certainties of the establishment can't be accepted, neither can we immediately jump out of the frying pan into the fire of some other certainty.
That's right. I am a curmudgeon in that sense, but not just to be mean and to spoil people's fun. I think the situation we're in is much too serious on the one hand, and much too rich in possibility, invention on the other, to grab on to a half-thought-through, sloppy-minded position, whether it's the moral majority on the one hand, or the new paradigm people on the other, or the Aquarian conspirators on the third hand, or what have you. These are grabbing at insufficient views for making sense of this kind of world. At a level of living in it, and instead of staying open and exploring and discovering and learning and experimenting, there's a tendency to grab for one or another metaphor from the right or the left or whatever terminology, from the spiritual or the operational, and give up that opportunity to discover. It's too soon to close the books on what the truth is.
Well, let's look at some of these proposed new realities. For example, Marilyn Ferguson and the Aquarian Conspiracy suggests that out of these turbulent times will precipitate a new world order based on spiritual values and a new science that will support those values, and that if people trust their intuitions, trust their hearts, that this is already happening, that we can kind of rely on it being optimistic. Well, my question to you about that is this: isn't it, even if this is untrue, isn't it better to have faith in a positive vision than to fear the worst? Because out of our fear, might we not create something unfortunate?
That's a delicate and important question of whether to believe the good and the hopeful in order to help make it become so, or rather than worry about the evil and the bad for fear of falling into that. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
It's more complicated than that, and there's more to it than that, it seems to me. If one only looks at the good and denies the shadow, the evil, the shadow in ourselves, the shadow in the nature of society, then, and only looks at the good and believes in the good, you leave yourself vulnerable and unwary. You can be attacked from all sides by those evil forces. You don't eliminate those forces by pretending they're not there. They're still there for those who haven't bought into the new view of things, and there are an awful lot of people who haven't bought into the Aquarian view, let's say. So my point is, one has to stay aware of both the possibilities and the difficulties, rather than an either-or position. And by being aware of both, taking both into consideration, that humans have nasty aspects as well as good. And that holds, by the way, for all the Aquarian conspirators as well. Anybody who claims only to be made up of the good and of somehow to overcome the evil is overcompensating, denying, and everything we know about human beings suggests that's a way of avoiding who they are. So, to my mind, only to subscribe to the good, the possible, and not pay attention to the other, trivializes the human condition, because it means that we're not dealing with full human beings in their full organizational and institutional and social ramifications, and until we do that, we can't really accomplish the good.
You seem to be saying, if I understand you right, that the kind of logic which says it's either this or that is an invalid logic, that a higher way of being in the world or of thinking in the world is to be able to simultaneously hold two ideas that might seem to be incompatible from the point of view of that logic.
Yes, yes, precisely. Given the kind of world we're in, where we don't have a mythology that does that for us, that says what is and what isn't, a belief about how reality is, then the only way to be learners, to discover, to create constructively, given the good and the bad in the world, is to be able to hold opposite ideas in mind, work with them, use them to alert us. After all, this is not a new idea. The yin-yang is an old form of the fact that you don't get one without the other, and you lose the coherence by only attending to part. So you've got to hold opposites. Yin-yang is opposites, and in the opposites comes the fullness.
It's very delicate, I think, though, in the sense, let's talk about the problem of evil again. There are those in the New Age movement who suggest that evil is really a myth, that there is no such thing as evil, it's only unskillful behavior or fear. It's not as if nasty things don't happen, but it's not based on some kind of an archetype of like diabolic evil in the soul of man, a satanic influence or anything of that sort. If you hold on to that idea, they claim that you may, then you project, then you deny, because you say it's outside rather than inside. And in the name of eradicating evil, many evil things are done.
You bet. The road hell is paved with good intentions, paved with good intentions. Yes, you're saying that they claim I've missed part of the point you're making now.
Well, I think
thought
the
there was
point
something there we
I'm
wanted to get
making
to.
is basically what they're saying is to let go of that notion of evil.
It's easy enough to let go of a notion of evil if you contain yourself in the part of the world where that doesn't happen to you. Walk out in the street and get struck down by some nasty human being, regardless of the source of their nastiness, and you got to deal with that evil. There's all kinds of nastiness in the world. There always has been. It doesn't go away by ignoring it or pretending it's not there.
I guess it's the label of evil that, but maybe we're getting a little bit off the point, because I don't want to debate the problem of evil with you. It's been around for thousands of years and still unresolved.
Let me make an additional, let me make one more observation on this though. Remember, anything that human beings say about human beings or about the world are creations of human beings. They're not statements independent of the fact that humans make them. So that whatever we say about these things, including what I say about these, are stories. And that's part of the both-and context, it seems to me. The recognition that we don't have a place to stand finally. What we do is tell stories. Some of them are more useful than others.
And one of our stories, I suppose, is say the story of science, which is a story that says, yes, we have some kind of absolute final knowledge about things, or at least maybe not final, because science does evolve, but experimentally proven we know what is real.
Well, no, I think that's really setting up a straw man.
Yeah.
I think what science and philosophy of science has been an interest of mine since adolescence, really. I've spent a fair amount of time as a physical scientist at one stage of my career. What the scientist says is that in the domain where scientific method can be used, which is a limited domain, because the method fits, it's possible to accumulate a set of understandings that relate phenomena to one another in a reliable way and in a predictable way. And that within that domain, that is as close as we come to fact, to something that's reliable and stays that way. The context for interpreting it changes, but the experimental information stays the same.
Well, I would agree with you. I think that's a very fair story about science. I guess what I was really describing is something that I think is very pervasive in the scientific community, which is sometimes called scientism.
Oh, well, yes. But that, I wouldn't tar most of the serious scientists with that. I think that's partly I don't believe it's that prevalent in the community. There are people who are that way, but I think a lot of the observations about scientism come from non-scientists rather than from
it's certainly a
scientists.
critique one sees in the New Age community.
Well, that's
quite a
because
bit.
they know very, very little about science. That's one of the limitations of the New Age. They talk a big line. Very few of them have ever been in the laboratory, ever done any work, understand the process of creating knowledge in a scientific way. They read what other people say about it, but that's not the same as experiencing it. And it's ironic that a view of life that puts so much emphasis on experience, the New Age, doesn't feel it's important to have had experience being a scientist in order to critique science. I think they miss it.
Yeah, well, there are, if I can counter that a little bit, my own experience, my own background in academia was in parapsychology, a small group of dedicated people using the scientific method and coming up with results that seem to be very empirically verified and yet contrary to certain assumptions of the scientistic worldview, such as, that the mind is equivalent to the brain, and having a large portion of the scientific community ignore them for that reason. So.
That's always a problem in science, and Polanyi wrote about that a long time ago, that you have to make an awfully good case to get those built-in biases shifted. And science is essentially a conservative activity. It's conserving, it's critical. But I agree with you when it comes to parapsychology and the like. Until fairly recently, and still to some important degree, the scientistic approach operates. Very often the everyday scientist doesn't know the limits of his own philosophy or her own philosophy.
And on the other hand, I, in reading your own work, came to see that because some of the New Age thinkers, the Marilyn Ferguson, Aquarian conspiracy people, and the new physics people, are open to parapsychology, I then might unquestioningly accept some of their other ideas about social change and the application of metaphors from the hard sciences and physics to social problems, which I gather you take issue with.
Yeah, I do very much so. Again, this is a matter of the lack of sophistication and the lack of careful thinking on the part of so many people in the New Age. They do not know their history of ideas. They do not really understand the difference between metaphor and analogy and fact. And so that you get this easy translation from one area to another when it isn't justified at all.
Well, let's talk about that a moment. You used the term earlier of storytelling, that really when we describe the world is what we're doing is telling stories. Now, how do you relate that to the distinction between metaphor, analogy, and fact?
Metaphor is when you don't want to get into definitions here, I take it. You wanted to, how do I see those as storytelling devices? There's one thing is to tell a story. Another thing is to believe that's the only story and that you're not telling a story. So I think it's useful to make analogies. A lot of what happens in science, for example, comes from making analogies. But then you have to be very careful to know when the analogy ceases to hold. When does the story not cease being a good story? But to do that, you really have to understand what you're dealing with on both sides of the analogy. Metaphor is where you, instead of saying something is as if it were something else, metaphor says it is something else. So that that's a very different connection in telling a story, rather as if. Science tends to operate as if. Poetry and other kinds of storytelling tend to operate as if something were the other thing. That leads to an enrichment of ideas and speculation, but you have to recognize they're ideas and speculations. They're not the truth at the point. So much of what goes on in the New Age now, I think, is appropriate and attractive speculation, but it's dealt with as if it were the truth. And
well,
that's
perhaps
what
in the
bothers
hope that if the world were this way, if we could choose to create a world, wouldn't it be nice to create a new age?
Sure, it'd be nice to create a new age, and in many ways things are happening, but that are different than what's happened before. A lot of things aren't different than what's happened before. So sure, it'd be nice to create a new age, but to do that, you have to be a lot more self-conscious about when you're being metaphorical, when you're being analogical, and when you're dealing with, for the moment at least, facts.
I think part of the difficulty that has resulted here is that there's a kind of an anti-intellectual flavor to people who are attracted to many of these stories, these mythologies, and these particularly spiritual visions. And I suppose it's commendable on the one hand that people are seeking transcendent states of being.
Sure, but you don't have to throw the baby out with the bath, as the saying goes. There are ways to seek transcendent experiences, to engage in spiritual development. I do, that's an important part of my life. But you don't mix that up with that which is what we call science, dealing with other certain aspects of the world, or with operational activities at another level having to do with government or organizations or that sort of thing. And those, when I say you don't mix them up, I mean you have to be self-conscious when you're mixing them up and not be sloppy-minded about it. So much of what goes on by way of so-called New Age thinking isn't new at all, but it isn't realized that it's not new. I've criticized
back to the romantic thing.
It goes back, not only the romantic, it goes back to the Age of Enlightenment. As far as I can make out, most New Age folks think the only thing they know about the Age of Enlightenment is Newton and Descartes, and they don't know much about them. but then we've transcended that. They don't know that most of the ideas that we incorporate with regard to being in touch with nature, that's prerequisite, are Enlightenment ideas. And what I'm objecting to is that lack of careful attentiveness to their own thinking, looking at the history of ideas, understanding where those ideas come from, understanding they live in a culture which engenders certain ideas rather than other ones, being self-conscious and sophisticated about their own thinking, rather than just mouthing somebody else's ideas.
Well, this brings us back to the point we started with in a way, and that is we live in an age of uncertainty. It's hard to know. I mean, you can read a lot of history and still not have a grasp of the structure of history. Even historians debate, what the real structure of history is.
Sure, but knowing that and knowing those arguments enriches your appreciation, one's appreciation of both the problems and possibilities in being human. There's no gain in ignoring that in order to have some simple-minded sense of surety and certainty. That's what bothers me about the moral majority as well as the New Age people. It isn't just, it's any group that chooses to ignore the rich setting, context of ideas and criticism of those ideas in order to find comfort in some half-thought-through story.
And I gather from your perspective that virtually includes spokespeople for every point of view, from every establishment to every alternative or anti-establishment group.
Absolutely. So we have most people running around believing in, espousing, insisting on ideas that float in the middle of nowhere and aren't adequate for dealing with the problems and the possibilities that this world has. They're just not enough.
I guess what bothers me about this is that when I take you seriously, and there's good reason to, it paints a rather frightening picture of our current condition, given the dangers that we're exposed to.
We are in a very frightening situation, not only in terms of nuclear war, but in terms of the environment, in terms of the political processes we use. We're in a very strange state of affairs. This has happened a few other times in human history, but where the mythology comes apart and everything is up for grabs. And in our case, what compounds that is the enormous interactive density of interdependences and relationships and the like. We really don't know how to deal with that, but we're not going to learn how to deal with it if we take simple-minded approaches to it.
So I guess if I feel some fear or despair, what you're saying is the one reason to be optimistic about all of this is that maybe we can learn.
Well, to be hopeful about it. Rollo May says that optimism and pessimism are conditions of the stomach. Hope is what you keep doing in the face of concern and doubt, but you keep working at it. Yes.
We're out of time, and I think this is a good point for me to stop you.
All right.
Donald Michael, thank you very much for being with me.
Well, I enjoyed it very much.
It's been a pleasure. It's been very rich indeed.
Good fun. Good conversation. Yeah.
And thank you very much for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a PDF copy or order a beautiful printed copy of Issue 6 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine.